Hi students! In this video I'm going to talk about content strategy creation because this week you will be creating a content strategy for your client. Let's go ahead and get started. So when you create a content strategy, you're really going through a process in which you conduct research, you analyze the research, you plan a content strategy, and then you execute the content strategy. So again, content strategy is a process, and in this class we're using a user-centered content strategy process, as content strategy should be. And so you start by researching users and analyzing what you found, and from that you create a plan. So you see the user-centered design process in action here, because the plan only comes after you've researched the users and understood their needs and their goals and how you can potentially help them. And then you execute the content strategy. So you conducted research last week, you did some demographic data lookup, you conducted a literature review, you conducted discourse analysis, and a couple interviews. And I talked last week as well about some other types of research that you could have done but were not required to do. I mean, types of research that are out there that you could do in a content strategy but that you're not expected to do for this class. And those were focus groups, observation, and reading what your buyers read to get a sense of the kinds of content they already consume. Now, this week I want to talk about some other types of research that I didn't cover last week. Research into your buyers is a great way to start in the user-centered design process, but with content strategy, you also can do research into the current site. So if your client currently has a site, you want to assess that. And you can do that in 4 different ways: through website analytics, through a content audit that focuses on a quantitative inventory, through a content audit that uses a strategic assessment, and through a content audit that uses best practices. So you'll see that 2 of these types are what's called qualitative and 1 is quantitative. And website analytics is basically quantitative as well. The difference is that the word quantitative comes from the word quantity. So in the quantitative audits, we're looking at numbers. We're looking at how much content do we have, and we can assess the quantity of the content and we can assess the content, but we're converting our assessment into numbers. So I'll show you an example in a minute. And then qualitative doesn't involve raw data, raw numbers as data. Qualitative are assessments in which you sort of write about the quality of the site. So let's take a look at analytics, the first type of research that you can do on a current site. Analytics just refers to visitor tracking on websites, and analytics are getting really advanced. They can track visitor demographics, they can track visitor behavior, and they can even track the interests of the people who are visiting your site. And we'll look at analytics later in the class, so you'll get a sense of how that works later on. But the big takeaway from analytics a lot of times that you can track page views and time on page. So on pages, so you get a sense of what people are actually looking at. So if you're creating a content strategy, it's certainly very helpful to look at the current site and see what people are already looking at, because then you can see what your audience already likes and you can do more of the same. And you can see what people don't really look at, and you know that those are areas that need improvement. So let's take a look at a screenshot from one of the analytics programs that I run. I use Google Analytics, and that's what you'll be using in this class. This is a screenshot of an analytics report of the Ball State Journalism Workshops website. I used to run that website and do the content for it, and I ran analytics on it, and you can see over a year, January 1st, 2012 to January 1st, 2013, we had 7,344 visits, which was really just 4,699 unique visitors. So as far as my analytics software could tell, we had about 4,700 different people who saw the site in a year. And you can see it displayed over time. So you can see there's definitely some times we have more traffic. Definitely we get more traffic March, April, May, around that time. Some traffic in July. We get like no traffic in October. So you can really drill down with this data. I mean, this is just one screenshot of one report. I'll show you how to do the drill down later in the course, but already you can see the benefits of looking at analytics. Because I can tell that there's certain times of the year that I'm just not getting people to look at what I'm doing. And so I can look at what am I doing during those times of the year. You know, maybe it's because I don't have an event or people aren't compelled to look at my content during those times of the year. With analytics, what's really nice is you can actually see just what people looked at. So I can get pretty much a history of what every visitor did. You know, did they start at the homepage and then go to about, or did they start at the homepage and go to the blog? You know, what did people do? So we'll look at that later, but I want to give you a sense of what analytics are now because it's a great way to assess a client's site when you're in the research phase. Another type of assessment that you can use on a current website as you start the content strategy process, if your client already has a website and you want to look at it before you go down the road of doing the whole process, is a quantitative inventory audit. So in this type of audit, you're basically just creating a spreadsheet of all the content you have. And this is a screenshot of a former student's quantitative inventory audit. We used to do quantitative inventory audits in this class, but I cut it out in order to have more time to focus on buyer research. So, and also because not all of you have a current site. Some of you have chosen clients where there is no website, and that's happened every semester. So this is not something we're going to do in class, but I want you to get a sense of what it is and what it looks like. So in this type of audit, a quantitative inventory audit, as you can see in the screenshot, you literally go to every page of the current website and you give it an ID, you give it a name, you know, it has a name on it already, and then you sort of assess it based on factors or criteria. So underlined here, you can see some assessment criteria that this student used, which were recommended in a reading we used to have about audits. And so what this student has done is she's looked at the homepage and she said, you know, what formats of content are here? T, P, and L. That translates to, T's cut off, but it's text, photos, and you can see L, links. And then she looked at things like audience. Who is the homepage directed at? And here she has RA and PA, which I apologize again, it's getting cut off, but I think it's a site for the Jar, which is a church in Muncie, and I think RA is like returning attendees, and PA might be potential attendees. So she's assessing every page, you know, who is this page for? And you can see patterns that almost every page is targeting RA and PA, returning and potential attendees. But maybe there's some audiences that she was hoping the website had targeted and they're not being targeted. And then you can see here she has accuracy labeled. 5 is totally accurate, 1 is inaccurate. So 3 is actually not a very good score. It's neutral. It means it's like kind of not really right. And so you can see there's some pages on the current site that are kind of not really right. And in fact, here's one that's a 2. So that staff page has factually inaccurate information. So you just go through page by page and you come up with some criteria you want to look at. You know, what is the goal of the new content strategy you're creating? Why are you now looking at doing something new? And then finding criteria that help you understand how you can do a better job. So quantitative inventory audit, you literally make a spreadsheet showing every page on the site and finding some determining criteria under which to assess those pages. Now, not every quantitative inventory audit includes all pages. There are some websites, I mean, the Ball State website has hundreds, if not thousands of pages, and to do an audit including every page would take too much time. So sometimes quantitative inventories are done with just like every 10th page or every home page for each section. You know, they sort of split the site and come up with an idea of, you know, let's just get some representative pages. The third type of assessment that you can run on a current client site before you start your content strategy is a qualitative strategic assessment. So in this type of content audit, you're just looking at the old site, you're looking at the old content strategy, and you're assessing whether the site actually does what the old content strategy was supposed to do. So this would be an assessment you would only do if there had been a content strategy before and there's a site that was supposed to show that content strategy. So you can look at content strategy elements like messaging, topics, voice, etc., and look at the content and sort of figure out, does it really do what it was supposed to do? You also can do this type of audit later in the process when you come up with a content strategy. You can look at the old site and do this process to see if there's anything there that would be worth keeping. So you could come up with a new strategy and then look at the old site and assess it based on that new strategy. And if you find content on the old site that does meet the new messaging, topics, voice, etc., then you can reuse it and you don't have to rewrite it for the new site. The last type of content audit is a qualitative best practices assessment. And in this audit, you just look at the current content on the current site that hasn't been redone yet and see if it uses best practices. Now, you'll learn best practices in this class. It's kind of like the whole point of the class is that you learn how to do a content strategy and then you learn the best practices for making it and the best practices for implementing it. So you're going to learn web writing standards, you're going to learn web photo standards, web design standards, but in this type of assessment you would need to know those ahead of time, and then you would look at the current site and see if those things are being met and get a sense of if the site is appropriately written, if the site is appropriately designed. Now, after you do these assessments, you have to create a report. And in this class, I always try to stress the importance of creating visuals in order to communicate. People learn quickly from visuals a lot of the time, and as a PR practitioner, you're going to go into a work environment where you're going to work with a lot of different kinds of people, different offices that do things completely different from the kind of training you've had and the kind of things you've done at your internships and that you do in your job. And you have to communicate with those people, and they don't understand the language of PR. They don't know what positioning is, they don't know what buyer segments are, and so you have to communicate with them, and a lot of the times visual communications can help get a point across when words and jargon fail you. So after the audit, you're going to create a report that you can share with your team or with your client if they want to see it. You're going to look at who are the stakeholders, who needs to know the status of the old site, and then you create a report. So this is an example from a great student I had in a previous class, and again, you're not doing a report because you didn't do an audit, but he did an audit, and his report starts with the client's name, and then he looks at the factors for the audit, and this is just one. And so he's saying, here's a factor I looked at. I looked at format. So I went to every page of the DAG website and I made a note about what content formats were on that page. So he explains that to you, and then he kind of explains the importance of that. So for someone in another office or another department who really doesn't know why anyone would care about format, he explains that, and then he provides this really nice visual summary in the form of a graphic showing the results. So you can see about half the site is text and 40% is photos. There's not very much social media, and there's 10% of things that aren't photo, text, or social media. So the site is almost equally text and photos, and that can be meaningful to the client. Maybe the client thinks that they're doing a really good job of social media. You can take this report and go to the client and say, actually, we looked at your whole site and you really don't have a lot of social media on there. And this graphic shows that, and it takes about 2 seconds to understand. So communicating with photos is almost always good, with visuals of some kind, drawings, things like that. But he does include text for those who are more textually driven. So how do you choose which of these audits to do? But you have to think about, what do you want to learn? What is it you really need to know about? Are you redoing the site because it's fallen into shambles and things don't work? In that case, maybe you want to do a quantitative assessment and look at what pages do work and what pages don't work, and which pages are old and which pages have crappy old information. A good example is if you have a client who read a book on web design and they think that they're now this web genius, and they made the site based on what they read in the book, which they totally misinterpreted, and now they're convinced it's perfect, and you keep telling them the site doesn't really meet, it's not really what it should be, and they keep saying, well, I read a book and I did everything it said, so I know it's right. Something like a best practices audit is what's going to help you communicate the information you need to communicate, because the client is saying, I did it the way I was told and it's right. And so you have to say, well, actually, here's what's not right about it. Here's what you misinterpreted. So looking at best practices and doing an audit would allow you to say, actually, you wrote it this way, but the best practice for writing is this. And so you can see the difference, right? So you really want to think about, what are you trying to learn? What do you need to prove to your client? How much time do you have? And then where are you in the process? Because you don't necessarily have to limit these audits just to the research phase. You can do an audit throughout. So for example, after you come up with a content strategy, you can start publishing some content, and then you can audit it to make sure the people who are publishing the content are using best practices or they're sticking to the content strategy. So these audits are things that you can do periodically throughout the life of your website, just to make sure everyone's still doing what they need to be doing. So again, you didn't do an audit. Not everyone's working with a client that currently has a site, so that would pretty much knock the audit out for about a third of you. And I also thought it was more important that you learned buyer research. So an audit and buyer research are often done together at the beginning of the content strategy process. And then audits can be done throughout as well, depending on the need for them. You know, do you need to make sure the strategy is being implemented correctly or what have you? So let's move on to the content strategy document. This is something that you will be creating this week in this class based on the research that you conducted last week. And first, I just want to give a little overview. One question I get is, I tend to use the word content strategy to mean a couple different things. So I want to talk about the difference between content strategy with a capital C and a capital S and content strategy lowercase. When I say content strategy with capitals, you know, I'm referring to the process of content strategy, the idea of going from goal to research to analysis to strategy to implementation. I'm talking about that whole process. When I say content strategy in like the non-capitalized way, which I know I'm saying it so you can't tell, but you'll sort of be able to pick up from context from now on, I'm just talking about your specific strategy. So I'm going to try to refer to your specific strategy as the content strategy document to avoid confusion, but I did want to make this distinction because I'm sure I will forget to add document at some point. So content strategy in the big sense with capitals is this idea of the process you go through to determine what kind of content is appropriate and then to make it. Content strategy, like, hey, you're making your content strategy this week, just means you're creating that document that outlines the strategy for your content. So I know it's a little bit confusing, but it's the same idea as design. You know, I'm a designer in the big capital D sense. I don't just draw pictures. I design things like classes. I design assignments. I design systems like the Google folder system that we're all using in this class to communicate your assignments. I design sort of in this big sense of looking at problems and finding solutions and designing ways of doing things. But I also am a designer in kind of like a little D sense where I make aesthetics, you know, I make logos, I make decisions about colors and typefaces. So we have the same distinction here, content strategy in the big sense of doing this whole process, and then content strategy in the sense of what is your specific strategy for your client this time. So what is the purpose of the content strategy document? Well, there's several reasons you want to create a content strategy document. You want to define the reason for the content strategy. So when you did research, you started by saying, what is the goal? Like, why are we even going to start making content for this client? What do they want to do? Do they want to increase membership by X amount? Do they want to make X amount more dollars? Do they want to increase donations by this percentage? So define the reason for content strategy. Why are we even bothering to do anything different? Why not just keep doing business as usual? You know, what inside the company is not working? Or not necessarily inside the company, but what between the company and its publics is not working? You also create a content strategy document just to get everyone on the same page. You want to have a document that you can refer people to. And I always stress the importance of keeping these sort of living documents that you can share with people, because one thing that you'll come across in the workplace is sometimes people will take things personally when it's not personal at all. I think discipline is a good example. You know, I've worked places where if you left cash sitting out, you got in trouble and you got written up, and it was nothing personal. You know, if you did this, you got written up, and it's in a policy book. And so, you know, you can have the best boss ever. The boss can be your best friend, and if you leave cash out and they see it, they kind of point to the policy and they say, you know what, I'm really sorry I have to do this, but according to this document, this is what happens, so sorry. Same with the content strategy document. You want to have a document that you can always refer people to. That way, if someone on your team comes up with this idea that's just crazy and not what you're trying to do at all, instead of saying, I don't like your idea, and hurting their feelings, you look at the strategy document and you say, you know, I appreciate your ideas, but as you can see in this document, it doesn't really fit in with what we're doing. So, you know, thank you for your contribution, but it just doesn't work with what we've all agreed needs to happen. So a content strategy document helps get everyone on the same page. And then again, you can check your work against standards. So as you build the website and you publish content, you know, 3 months after you start, 6 months after you start, a year after you start, you can check back at that document and make sure you're still doing what you're supposed to be doing. Over time, it's easy to sort of come up with new ideas and not even realize you're implementing new things and doing things differently than you agreed to. So it just keeps you honest to have a document to go look at and say, oh, you know what? I totally forgot I'm supposed to be doing this, or whoops, I've been messing up this secondary message. So a document helps you check your work against your standards. A document also helps you communicate to a client what you're doing. So if a client wants to know, you know, why is this the strategy you chose and like what does it do, you can show them your research and then you can show them the strategy document and it will outline to them what you're doing. And you all can also use the strategy document to review and elicit feedback before you implement it. So if you're working with the client, you can create the content strategy document and then take it to the client and say, you know, we think this is what we need to do and it's based off of all this research that we did. You know, we're not just making this up. What do you think? And they have something that they can look at and give you feedback on so you can improve your ideas and sort of get their buy-in in terms of what the strategy is doing. So in your reading, you looked at, you were presented with this sort of graphical representation of content strategy. And content strategy is made up of 5 elements: the core strategy, substance, structure, workflow, and governance. Now in this class, we're not really going to cover workflow and governance just because as a student, you really have no control over your client's workflow and governance. I mean, you can make suggestions, but you would have to get sort of more intimately involved in your client's everyday happenings than I think you're able to as a student who's sort of doing some work on the side for them. So we're going to focus on substance and structure. And the substance of a content strategy is the actual content. So what are you making? Is it photos? Is it web writing? What does it say? What message does it get across? What's the voice and tone of it? And then the structure is just how the site and the channels are organized. So how is the website organized? Or do you even have a website? Maybe your content all just goes straight out to YouTube and Twitter. If that's the case, then that's your structure. Workflow, who does what and when. So you determine who in the organization makes the content, who edits the content, who actually publishes it. You know, what are the steps to make content happen? And then the governance is the organizational tree. So who manages whom? Do you have editors? Do you have someone who has the final say on content? Who's in charge of who? And then this all centers around the core strategy, and the core strategy is explained in your strategy document. So the content strategy document explains what the strategy is for everyone, and that guides the substance and the structure and the workflow and the governance. So the core strategy, that document, is what everyone sort of rallies around and organizes their work around. It's the go-to place for instruction on what the strategy should be and what it does. It's a place to go for guidance if you have questions about if the structure meets the objectives, if the substance meets the objectives. So anyone working on substance, structure, if they have questions about, does this really accomplish the goal? You know, they check the core strategy in the content strategy document to see if it does. You begin development of your content strategy document by creating the core strategy statement. Now, this is different from the goal that you identified earlier. You identified a goal that had something to do with what the organization wanted to do. So were they trying to add members? Were they trying to make X amount of money? The core strategy statement really talks about what your site is going to be. So what is it going to accomplish in the eyes of the user? It's the statement from which the rest of your strategy follows. You keep that statement pretty short and sweet. It should be aspirational and motivational. And I had some students who crafted a really good example of a core strategy statement. What you're going to do is you're going to write basically a sentence that emphasizes what you're going to do on your site. What is your site going to be? And then you do what's called an annotation. So you identify key elements of your sentence and you explain them further. So this was actually a group of students were working on creating a new version of a site called I Love TCOM. I Love TCOM is currently a blog where a TCOM faculty member posts information for TCOM students about internships and potential jobs and things like that. These students created a new strategy for it, and so their core strategy statement defines what they want the site to be. And so they define it as an interactive TCOM student community that informs, engages, and excites. So this is the kind of thing that you would hope people would say about that website. When people go to I Love TCOM, you want them to think, oh, this is interactive and this is a really nice community. It's really informing, it's very exciting. So this is what you want the site to be. What are you going to do with that site? What are you going to turn it into? And there's another great example in your textbook. And you can see the annotations. What do the students mean by interactive? How is the site interactive? Well, there's engaging multimedia, including videos, photos, interactive posts. It's a community. It's not just one person posting information. It's a way to build relationships between TCOM faculty, students, alumni, and industry professionals. So it's a place where different audiences from TCOM, current students, recent graduates, all come together and feel a sense of pride in their shared community. It's informing, so it has up-to-date, relevant information. It's engaging. It has opportunities for involvement. It's not just a site that says, here's what we do. It's a site that says, here's what we do, and you should get involved. Here's how to get involved in this community. We love TCOM, come join us. And it excites. So it's inspirational. It inspires a love for Ball State TCOM. It creates enthusiasm and eagerness. So in this single core strategy statement, we have a description of what the site is going to be. What are you going to do on the site? You're going to create an interactive community for TCOM students that's informing, engaging, and exciting. That site is all about community. Your site might be all about selling. So how do you sell something? Create a informational site that provides product information to blah, blah, blah. So with the core strategy statement, you're really looking at what is your aspiration here. What do you want to be? Do you want to be the best site for blank? Do you want to be a great resource for this kind of audience who does this thing to do that thing? What do you want people to sort of feel about your site? For example, Amazon, what is their core strategy statement? It's probably something like create an easy-to-use website that gives people access to any product they could possibly imagine. It's very aspirational. That's kind of what Amazon is, right? So you start your content strategy document by explaining what you're setting out to do. So what do you want that site to be? How do you want people to sort of imagine it in their heads? So what are the parts of a content strategy document? Audience, messaging, topics, purpose, voice and tone, and sources. So audience, again, I think I've mentioned this to you guys before. Audience is really the same as buyers or users. I tend to use these terms interchangeably. But what you want to do in this section of your content strategy document is list all the possible buyer segments, which you actually did for your research phase. And then you're going to prioritize and rank those buyer segments. So you have to decide who is the most important buyer, and there has to be a level of importance. You can't please everyone with your content. This goes back to the whole discussion on the long tail. If you make something for everybody, you're not leveraging that long tail. You're not meeting the niche audiences where they are when they need the content. You're making a one-size-fits-all solution, and you've all had a one-size-fits-all piece of clothing, and guess what? It didn't fit. So you have to rank buyer segments and prioritize them. So in the audience section, you list them all and you rank them, and then for each audience section, you include a persona for that buyer segment. So every buyer segment is explained in a persona, which means you have to do research for every buyer segment. In the messaging section, you explain your messages, and messages are bits of info that you want buyers to know. And I talked in the research phase about you kind of have to decide what is each buyer segment and what should each segment believe about you. And that's your message, what they should believe about you and the information that makes them believe that. And messaging is the art of deciding what info you want to give and what info you want to get from users to get them to believe what you want. So the message is, what do you want them to believe and what info makes them believe that, and the messaging is coming up with those messages. You need to create a message hierarchy. There should be one message that's of utmost importance for each buyer segment, and this becomes your primary message. And this is very important for the web because people often don't read very much on the web, so they're not going to read that much of your site. So you have to have one message that you really sort of hit them over the head with over and over again, because they may not read any further than the headlines and the big pieces of type and things like that. They might not actually sit and read your entire blog. They're going to look at headlines, they're going to look at pictures. So what is the one message that they should take away, even if they don't really read that much or look at that much on your site? And then you create secondary messages for each. And what you do here is, for each buyer segment, you make this message hierarchy. So you have personas for each segment. Make a primary message for each persona. And just an example, in the last video I showed you the persona posters from MailChimp. Now, I do not work for MailChimp. I have not read any documents from them about their messaging, so I'm totally guessing and making up these messages, but I wanted to have an example that you've seen before to kind of help you tie all this together. But if you'll remember back to those MailChimp posters, one buyer segment was the PR manager. So maybe the primary message for PR managers is something like, MailChimp helps you connect with your targeted audiences directly and efficiently, because that's what PR people want to do, right? You want to get your targeted message to your targeted audience right to them directly. You want to speak to them directly, and you want it to be efficient. So secondary messages that sort of support that message are things like MailChimp is so easy to use that you can focus on your message and not on pressing buttons, because no one wants to work with a piece of technology that they have to sit and spend a lot of time with. Like, if you're a PR manager, you want to focus on making good messages, not clicking buttons and learning how to use MailChimp. You don't have time to sit and be a MailChimp expert. You are a PR expert. A secondary message could also be something like, you could manage audiences from big to small, because PR managers have different publics that they need to reach. Sometimes they need to reach a very small group, and sometimes they need to reach a very large group, and MailChimp lets you do that. A secondary message that supports the primary message could be something like, our design tools help your message to stand out. You don't have to know design really to use MailChimp and to make a communication that looks good. Now, for the studio consultant persona, the message could be different. It could be something like, keeping in touch with clients becomes a breeze. Because studio consultants, and here I confess I'm not 100% sure on what they mean by studio consultants. I don't work with studio consultants, so I looked it up. I looked at some job descriptions. I could be totally off base, but the sense that I got is that studio consultants are in charge of working with clients. You know, they're design studio consultants. They consult with clients in order to funnel work into design studios, things like that. So studio consultants may not really care about the primary message, that you get to reach out to targeted audiences. What they care about is that they have clients they're supposed to be consulting with all the time. So their primary message might be something like, keeping in touch with clients becomes a breeze. And a secondary message that supports that could be something like, you can manage client types to send targeted messages to each. So you can see that each buyer segment, which is represented by a persona, gets its own primary message and secondary messages. Let's move on to topics. Your reading defines topics as audience plus messaging, and what that means is that you've identified what problem your organization solves for its buyers. And so you know your audience, you know what their problems are. You know what you want them to believe about your organization. Develop topics that show how you solve that problem and get them to believe what you want them to believe. So they provide your primary message. So they say, you know what, here's your problem, here's how we fix it, and in that, make sure they pick up that primary message. So as an example, I know I've talked about the Ball State Journalism Workshops website. I used to work there and manage the website and the content on it, and actually all of the marketing. in communications. And so as an example, one of our audiences obviously is current high school students who are involved in journalism, who we want to come to our workshops. And the message for them is that our workshop is the best. It's for exceptional students who want to be cutting edge. There's lots of journalism camps, but there's not a lot of journalism camps. They're going to help you be in touch with today's media and really put you ahead of the curve. That's what we offer that most other workshops don't offer. There's other workshops students go to where they like get out paper and pens and they draw. Like they don't even have computers in some of these places. So that's what we offer. That's our primary message, is like, if you are a journalism student and you want to get ahead and you want to be cutting edge, come here, because that's what we do. And so if we combine our message and our audience, topics could be things like workshop attendance, right? Because our audience is potential attendees who are in high school. Our history and about us, our special programs, how to choose a college that's innovative. We had lots of how-tos on design and digital journalism, and I'll explain these in a little bit more detail when we get to purpose, which is next. So this next part of the content strategy is purpose. So each piece of content is assigned a purpose. No piece of content should just be there to be there. That's a mistake that a lot of websites make, is they feel like they need to make content, so they just make stuff. You know, they say, let's have a blog, and we're going to have all the employees contribute to it, and the employees don't get any guidance on what the purpose of the blog is, and so they just write stuff like, oh, you know, I was thinking about my dog today and it reminded me I sure love dogs. No, it's not going to happen. You have to have a purpose for every piece of content. So you come up with in your strategy some of the main purposes of content. Persuade, inform, validate, instruct, entertain. There can be more than this. These are the ones that are suggested in your reading. So going back to those workshop examples, when we look at topics, one is workshop attendance information. Well, what is the point of that? It's to inform our audience. What is the point of our history and about us? Twofold. It informs, but most people probably don't really care about our history, so what it really does is it persuades. It sends that message that we know what we're doing. The workshops office, I think it actually might be the oldest one in the Midwest. It's been around since the 60s. Like, we are serious business, right? So talking about our history, we know no one really cares about our history, but it's a good way for us to be like, look, we've been around for a long time. Like, we kind of know what we're doing. Our special programs inform and persuade, again, because it informs students about our programs, but also persuades by showing the diversity of our programs and how cutting edge our programs are. Topics like choosing a college help validate and instruct. So they instruct students on what to do, which at the end of the day is apply to Ball State and come to Ball State, right? Because it's Ball State office. And they validate us as a knowledgeable source. And same with how-tos. We had a lot of how-tos on our site about design and digital journalism, and that not only instructs students who are hungry for instruction in these cutting edge areas, but it also validates. It says, you know what, we kind of know what's up. Like, we do design and digital journalism. A lot of places don't. We do. So it validates our credibility and our superiority as a workshop for talented high school students. Next, second to last, you're going to look at voice and tone. Voice reflects the personality of your company. I think it often helps to think about your organization as a person. Is your organization, fun-loving and friendly, or is your organization, stern and school-marmy? And in a later lecture, I'll talk about the PC and Mac advertisements. I'm sure you've all seen them. There's two gentlemen in the ad, and one says, "Hi, I'm a Mac," and the other says, "Hi, I'm a PC." And the way they're dressed and the way they act represent each company as a person. So PC is sort of a bumbling, stuffy wannabe, and not very exciting, very boring, very work-oriented. He's dressed in a boring business suit. And then Mac is like a cool 20-something, like you'd want to hang out with them. So it can help to think about your organization as a person and think about their personality, and that can guide your voice. And the voice of PC in those ads, he talks very much like a stuffy business person, whereas the Mac talks conversationally like he's your friend. So again, it helps to think about your organization as a person and think about their personality, and that guides the voice. Now, the tone reflects the audience's emotional state in different situations. So I'm going to show you an example. Voiceandtone.com is actually owned by MailChimp. Let me pull it up. Let me start at the beginning. And on this site, MailChimp shows how they think about voice and tone. Okay, there we go. So the voice of MailChimp is very friendly. MailChimp is a fun, I mean, their logo is like their mascot's a monkey. It's a fun, excited, friendly, young, hip organization represented by this cartoon monkey. I mean, cartoon monkey, I feel like sums up the voice very well. The voice you would expect from a playful cartoon monkey. But tone is situational. So here's a good example. Let's click get started. Let me click on success message. So here what they've done is they're looking at when this message is provided. So what's the situation? And in this case, it's success. So how does the user feel? Again, let me move this out of the way really quick. The tone reflects the audience's emotional state. So when the audience has succeeded in doing something on the site, what is their state? Relief, pride, joy, and anticipation. So MailChimp responds with this tone: excitement, exclamation points, patting the user on the back, being funny. So the personality, fun-loving chimp, friendly, cares about you. Tone, exciting, patting on the back. Now, when we look at failure message, this is an instance in which the user has done something wrong or incorrect, or something has failed, and they're being told a failure has happened. So how does the user feel? What's their emotional state? Confusion, stress, and anger. So look at the tone of the communication. We're experiencing a problem at one of our data centers. Our engineers are on the case, and we have things back to normal shortly. So this is not the fun-loving, jokey pat on the back. Instead, it's straightforward, it's calm, it's serious, but at the same time, it still represents the personality of MailChimp. It says, we're on the case. You know, that's not something you would expect from an organization that's really stuffy and stodgy. You wouldn't expect PC from the Mac and PC commercials to go, oh, we're on the case. So it does match the personality of the friendly, fun-loving monkey, but in this particular experience, in this particular context, the user is freaked out. So they don't want jokes, they don't want exclamation points. And another good example is the compliance alert. If a user has not complied with something, what are their feelings? They're confused, they're angry, they're feeling helpless, they're scared. And again, what is the tone? Straightforward, calm, and serious. We had to suspend your account with the username, whatever, due to an unusually high unsubscribe rate on a campaign. So again, it's not fun-loving, it's not jokey, but it still matches the voice of the organization because it matches the personality of a friend. They're explaining what you did wrong in a straightforward way, but they're explaining it to you like they know you and they understand you're scared and they're trying to help you, just like a friend would. So this is a great site to see the difference between voice and tone. And again, it's just called voiceandtone.com. But just to reiterate, the voice reflects the personality of a company at all times, and the tone reflects an audience's emotional state in specific situations. And last but not least, the final part of your strategy document is where content comes from. Is it user-generated? Is it created in-house? Is it created by another company? Is it aggregated from online? Are they just pulling it from somewhere online? Are you reusing content from another part of the organization? These are all things you want to think about when you start the strategy, so as you implement, you know where the content's going to come from. So let's talk a little bit about how your content strategy document is different. Instead of creating a document that goes into detail about all of the audiences, you're going to list all the audiences just like you did in the last assignment, but then you're going to choose the one that you researched. They're going to be the primary audience you're going to work with, and you're going to write the rest of the document just about them. So normally, if you had 5 audiences, you would have 5 primary messages, 1 for each audience. In this case, for what you're doing, you're going to make a primary audience, and then you're just going to make a primary message for them, and you're not going to worry about making primary messages for the other audiences. Same with the topic map, same with the persona. You're going to include your persona from last week. You don't need to make a persona for the audiences that are not primary. For this class, you're going to focus on one buyer segment rather than try to create different messages, different personas, and different topic maps for all the different audiences. The scope of that is a little bit too large for a 16-week class. So you also won't include sources, and that's because you'll be making your own content. So I'm not going to ask you to make anything unless I have a lesson on how you make it. So you'll look at web writing, you'll look at photos for the web. You're not going to include sources in your content strategy document because you're going to make everything. That's it. Now you just need to go craft your document.